I had always loved the quiet hum of the lab, the soft rhythm of machinery, the faint scent of sterile antiseptic, the way the fluorescent lights glowed over my workbench like a halo for the world I controlled. But that morning, nothing felt normal. The air had a tension I couldn't place, like a storm hovering just out of sight. Silas Thorne was there, of course. Calm, impeccably dressed, eyes sharp and calculating. I should have sensed it. The way he lingered behind the safety glass during containment tests, never touching the manual override, watching like a predator studying prey. But I had been too focused on the data, on the sequences and probabilities, on what could save lives and what could advance our research. The breach happened in a fraction of a second. The containment unit cracked, sparks flying, and before I could even react, a violent explosion tore through the lab. My prototype suit, my pride and my shield, absorbed most of the blast, but not all. I was thrown against the far wall, the impact knocking me unconscious. When I woke, the acrid smell of smoke stung my eyes, and the heat from the small fires flickered across the wreckage. My first instinct was to reach for the override, to stabilize the lab, but then I remembered Silas. He hadn't moved. He had watched. He had let me fight through the flames and chaos as if my survival were irrelevant. And that realization struck harder than any explosion. I climbed to my feet, suit scorched, and scorched pride burning brighter. My heartbeat was steady, but my mind was racing with a lethal clarity I hadn't known I could access. Silas didn't just betray my trust. He had reduced me to a biological asset, something to be watched, studied, and discarded once my utility ended. For the first time, I saw the truth of my life with clinical, cold precision. The carefully constructed facades, the smiles and reassurances, the promises of partnership and collaboration, they were all lies. I had been a pawn in his ambitions, and my survival had been a spectacle for his amusement. I straightened my scorched lab coat, every muscle taut, every nerve buzzing with calculated focus. I wouldn't cry. I wouldn't panic. I would plan. Every action from this moment forward would be deliberate, precise, and unstoppable. I checked my phone. Nothing. Silas had already cleared most digital traces. But I noticed a small anomaly, a live feed I hadn't installed. My pulse quickened, but not with fear. With purpose. My fingers flew over the screen, hacking the feed in ways I had only ever imagined in simulations. And then I saw it. Silas, in my home, casually introducing Elena into my life, laughing at a plan I hadn't even known existed. My wedding dress burned in the fireplace, a symbol of my personal life reduced to ash. The betrayal was perfect, brutal, and yet it fueled me. I wasn't just Mirabelle, the geneticist. I was Mirabelle reborn, sharp, unstoppable, and ruthlessly objective. Every calculation, every sequence, every risk would now serve one purpose: exposing Silas, reclaiming my research, and ensuring no one could ever treat me as an asset again. The fire had tried to destroy me. Silas had tried to discard me. But I was alive, and I had seen everything. The moment I saw Silas in my home with Elena, something inside me shifted. That cold, calculated part of my mind, the part one had honed over years in the lab, clicked into full operation. No panic, no tears. Only observation. Only strategy. I slipped out of the lab under the guise of routine errands and installed a series of discrete cameras in the house. Every room, every hallway, every vulnerable angle, I covered it all. By the time I returned to my office, the live feeds were streaming seamlessly to my phone. I was no longer just a researcher. I was a sentinel, a scientist with proof, evidence, and a plan forming like DNA sequences aligning perfectly. The first few hours were almost anticlimactic. Silas moved through the house with his usual air of superiority, confident that I was unaware, that I was still vulnerable. Elena followed, laughing at jokes I would never hear, mimicking a domestic bliss I had built but that had been stolen from me. And then I caught him, Silas, speaking softly, almost reverently, as if discussing a prized experiment rather than a human being. "Mira is just a biological asset," he said, voice low, almost intimate. Once I have her research, I'll commit her to a psych ward. Elena, you'll take her place, the lady of this house. Elena giggled. I felt my stomach twist, not with fear, but with an icy, surgical rage. He wasn't just betraying me professionally, he was erasing me personally, destroying every memory and bond one had built in that life. I leaned back in my chair, letting the rage settle into meticulous calculation. The feed didn't lie. I could pause, rewind, examine every nuance. He had underestimated me because I had survived once. But he had no idea who I had become. By evening, I had compiled hours of footage, cross-referencing every statement with past research notes, lab logs, and digital timestamps. Silas had been methodically siphoning my data, framing every move to appear routine while creating a network of theft and deceit. Every frame of video, every message, every misfiled experiment was a piece of evidence I could use to dismantle him. And I realized something. I didn't just want revenge. I wanted justice. Scientific, unassailable, and absolute. He had reduced me to an object. I was going to reduce him to the truth, exposed, powerless, and accountable. As night fell and the lab hummed quietly around me, I felt a strange satisfaction. Every detail had been logged, every angle secured. My world had been violated, my trust weaponized, but I had regained control. The rebirth wasn't just survival. It was preparation. And by the time Silas realized I had seen everything, the boardroom, the scientific community, and even the legal system would be aligned against him. I wasn't Mirabelle the naive researcher anymore. I was Mirabelle, fully aware, ruthlessly objective, and ready to strike. The next morning, I arrived at the lab before sunrise. The sterile hum of the machinery, once comforting, now felt like a battlefield I had already won in my mind. Every step, every instrument, every file became a piece of strategy. Silas had underestimated me, not just my intellect, but my capacity for meticulous vengeance. I reviewed the live feed from the night before, frame by frame. His words, his gestures, Elena's laughter, all meticulously logged. I labeled every file, encrypted every copy, and backed it up to a hidden drive. This wasn't impulsive. This was methodical, clinical, and precise. Then came the question, how do I turn this evidence into action? Silas's influence was vast, his reach almost untouchable in the corporate and scientific worlds. But there was one person whose reputation was unassailable, whose intellect and credibility could make him a lethal ally. Alistair Grant. I had met Alistair once, years ago, during a conference on advanced genetics. Brilliant, reclusive, intimidating, but he respected integrity and ethical science above all else. And I knew Silas feared him, not just for his knowledge, but for his power to expose corruption and hold those responsible accountable. I sent Alistair a carefully coded message. No embellishments, no emotion, only facts, only evidence that required attention. Within hours, he responded with a single line. I see you. Meet me at the old observatory at 6 p.m. That evening, I arrived, cautious but composed. Alistair was already there, leaning against a telescope, glasses reflecting the dim light. He didn't smile, but his eyes held an unmistakable recognition, respect, and intrigue. You're serious, he said, voice low and controlled. And precise. Silas doesn't know you've compiled this. Not yet, I replied. I have hours of footage, cross-referenced with lab logs and patent filings. He's been systematically siphoning my research, preparing to use it to launch a new drug under his name. Elena's complicity confirms he's orchestrated everything to appear legitimate while discarding me. Alistair nodded, scanning the data I had brought. He's reckless but clever. This is damning. And it's enough. If we move carefully, we can render his patents worthless, expose him to the board, and ensure the scientific community sees the truth. I felt a flicker of anticipation, but not excitement.
Control, focus, strategy.
That was my mindset now. I want precision. No mistakes. He underestimates me because he believes in theatrics, not evidence. We'll use his own arrogance against him. Alistair's lips curved slightly, almost approvingly. Good. You've survived fire, betrayal, and near death. Now, we'll turn all that survival into an unassailable victory. And you won't just reclaim your research, you'll make sure he can never harm anyone else again. As I left the observatory that night, I felt the first true sense of partnership I had ever known. Not romance, not yet, but alignment. A shared intelligence, shared purpose, and the promise that every move from now on would be calculated, deliberate, and lethal in its precision. Silas had believed he could discard me. He had no idea how thoroughly I would reconstruct my world and his downfall from the evidence he had so carelessly exposed. The morning after meeting Alistair, I returned to the lab with a single focus, turning every ounce of betrayal into evidence that could no longer be ignored. Silas had believed that by isolating me, controlling access, and planting Elena as a distraction, he could erase my contribution and claim everything. He had miscalculated. I spent hours analyzing every corrupted file, every misused sequence, every misfiled experiment. Each one was a puzzle piece, and now I had the map. I cross-checked them with my own original research, documenting where he had altered variables, masked sources, and even manipulated timelines to claim precedence. Every discrepancy was proof of fraud and intellectual theft. By noon, I had compiled a dossier so thorough that even the most biased board member or peer reviewer would have no choice but to acknowledge the facts. But evidence alone wasn't enough. Silas thrived on appearances. He was polished, persuasive, and terrifyingly smooth in public. We needed a strike that couldn't be ignored, an airtight, patent-backed revelation. Alistair arrived in the late afternoon, carrying a stack of legal documents and his own meticulously annotated research. He was quiet, observing my work with that piercing focus that always made me feel simultaneously exposed and protected. "You've thought of everything," he said finally, reviewing the spreadsheet of sequences and timestamps I had prepared. "This isn't just proof, it's a blueprint. We can file an opposing patent, invalidate his claim, and expose every flaw in his process. If we time it right, the board and regulatory authorities will have no choice but to act immediately." I felt the familiar surge of clarity. Then we don't waste time. Every minute, he continues, he could cause harm, not just to me, but to patients, investors, and the integrity of our field. I want him dismantled before he can make a move. Together, we executed the filings. Alistair navigated the legal and academic channels with precision, while I provided the raw, incontrovertible data. Every clause, every reference, every timestamp reinforced the narrative. Silas had stolen, manipulated, and endangered lives to claim personal profit. Later, as we watched the confirmation emails appear, patents successfully filed, regulatory alerts triggered, I allowed myself a small, rare smile. Silas's empire was beginning to crumble. He had underestimated the depth of my resilience and the precision of my mind. Alistair's hand brushed mine as he handed me a folder containing copies of every submission. "This is just the beginning," he said softly. "But you should know, working with you, seeing your intellect in motion, has been remarkable." I felt a warmth, unbidden, at the contact. Not intrusive, not possessive, but grounding. A partnership forged in mutual respect, intellect, and purpose. "We do what must be done," I replied. "And then we ensure nothing like this can happen again." For the first time since the explosion, I felt the calm satisfaction of control. Silas had believed he could erase me, diminish me, and manipulate my life. Instead, he had given me the opportunity to rebuild, stronger, sharper, and unstoppable. And as the sun set outside the lab windows, casting a warm glow over the instruments and the meticulous chaos of our strategy, I realized something crucial. Survival had given way to mastery. And mastery, coupled with Alistair's partnership, would ensure that nothing and no one could ever compromise my life or my research again. The day of the board meeting arrived, and the weight in the air was palpable. Silas had no idea what was coming. He always thrived on control, on the illusion that he could manipulate every detail. But today, I was the one holding the cards, and for the first time, every move I made would be deliberate, visible, and lethal in its precision. I entered the boardroom early, carrying a laptop loaded with the compiled evidence, every sequence, timestamp, and log meticulously labeled. Alistair followed quietly, calm and unshakable, the kind of presence that made even the most confident board members sit straighter. I caught his eye, and for a brief moment, there was a spark, not just of alliance, but of trust. Silas arrived shortly after, all charm and bluster, confident in his rehearsed spiel. He glanced at me and smiled, a predator sensing prey, but I felt nothing but cold clarity. As the meeting began, he launched into his presentation, outlining his original research, patent claims, and projected drug rollout. Every word was polished, every slide rehearsed. But I had anticipated everything. I stood, closing my laptop with deliberate slowness, and said, "I think it's time the board sees the full record." Murmurs rippled across the room. Silas's smile faltered. Alistair stepped forward and opened the first document. Each piece of evidence was displayed. The manipulated logs, the missing timestamps, the misappropriated sequences. I narrated calmly, clinically, explaining every step Silas had taken to claim my research as his own. Silas has systematically altered experimental data to appear as original work, I said, voice steady. Every sequence you've seen in his patent filings has either been directly copied or subtly manipulated from my research. He endangered patient trials and misled investors. His so-called innovations are built on theft, deception, and exploitation. The room fell silent. Silas's color drained, his polished confidence cracking. Board members whispered among themselves, flipping through the folders and digital files I had provided. Every question he tried to answer only reinforced the meticulousness of our evidence. Alistair leaned in beside me, voice low. "I've reviewed everything independently. Myra's claims are indisputable. The patents she filed predate his, and the discrepancies in his data are glaring. There is no defense." By the end of the presentation, Silas's authority had evaporated. The board voted unanimously to place him on immediate suspension pending investigation. Regulatory authorities had already been alerted by our filings, and the legal team began preparing charges of intellectual theft, fraud, and endangerment. As the room cleared, I felt a hand on my shoulder, Alistair's. He looked at me with a mix of pride and something softer, something almost personal. "You handled that brilliantly. Every step, every word, precise, unshakable. You've reclaimed everything he tried to take from you." I exhaled, feeling the tension in my shoulders finally ease. "We did it together," I said, letting a small smile break through. "I couldn't have done this alone." He nodded, eyes meeting mine with a quiet intensity that made my chest tighten. "No, you couldn't. But now we can start building, scientifically, ethically, and maybe personally too." For the first time since the explosion, I allowed myself to imagine the future, not just in terms of research, but in terms of partnership, trust, and even the possibility of love. Silas had tried to destroy me, but I had survived, strategized, and now I was reborn, not just as a researcher, but as someone unstoppable, with Alistair by my side. The following morning, I arrived at the lab before sunrise, fueled by a mixture of anticipation and cold determination. Silas thought the boardroom exposure had shaken me, but the real work was only beginning. He might have lost authority temporarily, but until every last loophole was sealed, he still posed a threat. Alistair was already there, leaning over a microscope, his concentration absolute. "You're up early," he said without looking up. "I don't sleep until he's neutralized," I replied, my fingers flying over the keyboard as I reviewed the latest batch of filings. Every sequence, every log, every timestamp has to align perfectly. There's no room for error. Alistair finally looked up, meeting my gaze. "I admire your precision, Mira. But remember, you're not just proving theft, you're establishing ownership and credibility. That's what will make this irrefutable." I nodded, then gestured toward a monitor.
"Here."
I cross-referenced our data with Silas's public filings. Any gaps or anomalies are highlighted. Once we submit these revisions as the official rival patent, there's no way he can reverse it without exposing himself further. Alistair's lips curved slightly. And the board can't ignore this. Once the patent is public, any attempt at fraud or replication is legally binding and catastrophic for him. I allowed myself a brief smile. He always underestimated me. Always thought charm and status could replace substance. He forgot I'm trained to analyze every variable and I have patience. Alistair stepped closer, lowering his voice. You've always been remarkable at that. Calculating, precise, unstoppable. But I think it's more than just intellect driving you now. I raised an eyebrow. More than intellect. Yes, he said, his eyes locking with mine. There's fire, determination, and something I can't quite define. You're relentless. I felt heat creep into my cheeks but pushed it down. Relentless only because I've learned what betrayal feels like. He chuckled softly. I understand. And you should know, I'm not just here for the science. I want to be here for you. In every sense that matters. I blinked, surprised by the sudden intimacy, but there was no hesitation in his sincerity. We'll see, I said cautiously, letting the words hang in the air. Focusing back on the screen, I began the final preparations for submission. Every line of code, every document, every sequence had been verified and cross-checked. Alistair stood by, offering occasional insight, but mostly observing my methodical precision with an approving gaze. Ready? He asked finally. Ready, I confirmed. I clicked the final submission. The rival patent was launched. Immediately, the system generated confirmations. Silas's attempts to claim my research would be legally void, and any remaining intellectual theft would be traceable, undeniable, and prosecutable. Alistair grinned, a rare, genuine smile. Now we wait and watch the fallout. He's finished. I leaned back, a surge of satisfaction coursing through me. Finished professionally. And personally, I intend to make sure he never underestimates anyone again. Alistair's hand brushed mine, light but deliberate. And I'll be here, every step of the way. For the first time since the lab explosion, I allowed myself to exhale, letting the adrenaline fade into a controlled, deliberate calm. We had executed the plan perfectly, and in that moment, I realized my rebirth wasn't just about surviving, it was about thriving with Alistair by my side, both in science and in life. The morning news hit like a storm. Headlines flashed across every scientific journal, corporate outlet, and regulatory feed. Silas Thorne's pharmaceutical fraud exposed. Rival patent invalidates research claims. I sipped my coffee, fingers lightly tapping on the edge of the mug, watching as the world finally caught up to the truth I already knew. Alistair appeared beside me, leaning casually against the counter. He didn't see it coming, did he? He said with a hint of satisfaction. No, I replied, voice steady. He never does. He thrives on appearances and intimidation, but he forgot that data, facts, and evidence don't lie.
And he underestimated me.
That's always been his flaw. The phone rang. I answered, half expecting Silas's panicked voice. It was one of the regulatory attorneys confirming the legal notices. Silas was officially under investigation for intellectual theft, fraud, and endangerment of clinical trials. His patents were frozen, and any ongoing projects were immediately suspended. Alistair's eyes darkened, a mix of triumph and warning. This is just the beginning. The board can act, but if he resists or fights back, there's still more to dismantle. Are you prepared for that? I set my cup down, feeling a thrill of control. I've anticipated every possible maneuver. I've already secured the evidence trail. Anything he tries now will only accelerate his exposure.
The doorbell rang.
I frowned. Who could that be? Alistair gave a small smirk. Probably a reporter. Or maybe someone delivering a legal notice. Either way, it'll be interesting. I opened the door to a young journalist, clipboard in hand, eyes wide with curiosity. Dr. Mirabelle? Can I ask a few questions about the recent pharmaceutical patent dispute? I gestured for her to come in. Of course. but I answer only the facts. She nodded eagerly. Were you aware of the misappropriation of your research by Silas Thorne? Yes, I said calmly, letting each word land. And I've taken the necessary steps to ensure the integrity of my work is preserved. All evidence has been documented and submitted to regulatory authorities. Integrity and transparency are paramount in science, and nothing, not ego, not ambition, should compromise that. Alistair leaned close and whispered, "You handled that beautifully. And the way you commanded the narrative, he doesn't stand a chance." I felt a flush of pride, but also warmth at his presence. "We handled it together," I said softly. His hand brushed mine, and I let it linger, allowing a small, private acknowledgement of trust and partnership. Later that afternoon, Silas's world began crumbling. Calls from investors, emails from the board, and legal notices flooded in. Every misstep he had made, every attempt at manipulation, was now public and indisputable. I watched it unfold with clinical detachment at first, then a quiet satisfaction. He had treated me as expendable, now he was irrelevant. Alistair placed a hand on my shoulder. "You've reclaimed everything, Mira. Your research, your reputation, and your life." I smiled at him, finally allowing a glimmer of personal victory.
Yes.
And this time, nothing and no one will take it from me. He squeezed my shoulder gently. "And I'll be here. Not just professionally." I met his gaze, letting the moment linger. There was no fear, no hesitation, just trust, respect, and the first stirrings of something more. For the first time since the lab explosion, I felt both unstoppable and unafraid to let someone in. The sun filtered through the lab windows that morning, casting a warm glow over my meticulously organized workspace. For the first time since the explosion, I felt a sense of calm, not just victory, but rebirth. The fire, the betrayal, the near-death experience, they had forged me into someone stronger, sharper, and unshakable. And now, for the first time, I could allow myself to envision a future beyond revenge and recovery. Alistair arrived quietly, as he often did, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He didn't need to speak. Just being there felt grounding. "Morning," he said softly, placing 1 cup in front of me. "Morning," I replied, smiling. "I wasn't expecting you so early." He shrugged, his usual composed expression softened by something warmer, something personal. "I wanted to make sure you start your day with a sense of accomplishment. You've earned it." I lifted my cup, meeting his gaze. "We've earned it. Together." Alistair's lips curved in a rare smile.
Yes.
Together. The day was spent finalizing reports, responding to inquiries, and ensuring that Silas's influence had been fully neutralized. Every email, every confirmation of regulatory compliance, every acknowledgement of our patent filings was a small victory, but the larger triumph was personal. I had survived everything, and now I was stepping into my life fully, without fear. Later, as the lab emptied and the hum of machinery settled into quiet, Alistair lingered. He leaned against a counter, arms crossed, eyes thoughtful. "You've changed, Mira," he said. "The fire didn't just test you. It remade you. And I think it's made room for something else." I raised an eyebrow. "Something else?" "Yes," he said, stepping closer.
Trust. Partnership.
"Maybe even more than that. You've fought for your life, for your work, and you've won. I want to be part of what comes next, not just professionally, but with you." My chest tightened in a way I hadn't expected. I studied him, remembering the first time we collaborated, the careful strategy, the respect for intellect that had slowly deepened into something more. And now, here he was, offering something different. Trust, protection, and companionship. I paused, letting the words find their rhythm. "I think I want that too. I've spent so long guarding myself, I forgot what it felt like to let someone in." He reached for my hand, gentle but deliberate. "Then let me in. No games, no manipulations, just us moving forward together." I allowed his hand to close over mine, a small but powerful gesture of connection. "Together," I echoed. As we stood there, hands entwined, I realized that the rebirth wasn't just about surviving Silas's betrayal or reclaiming my research. It was about reclaiming my life, fully and without reservation. The trauma had sharpened me, but love, real, measured, trustworthy love, would make me whole again. And with Alistair by my side, I knew the future was no longer a threat to fear, but a path to shape. Science, justice, and love, all aligned, all unshakable. I had been reborn. And this time, nothing and no one could take me down.